20 for Good webinar series. And today's focus is on digital public infrastructure for Agri-Innovations. My name is Tariro Nyimo, and I'm the head of stakeholder engagement and fundraising at Digital Frontiers. Now, 20for Good is a multi-stakeholder movement recently launched by Digital Frontiers, and its aim is to direct 20% of all future jobs towards SDG innovations. Now, we're talking about jobs that not only comply with decent work frameworks or green jobs frameworks, but are uniquely and specifically set aside for the world's most pressing issues, such as zero hunger, that's agriculture. And within Digital Frontiers, we've convened what we call a frontier seminar, where agricultural experts are coming together and exploring the 20for Good concept to see if it's a worthy cause, if it's something that can be launched and acquire support and funding. So after the frontier seminars, we'll build the body of evidence that supports the concept and convene working groups that will explore further and actually design some programming that can be executed into the market with the vision to scale. Now, today's focus, coming back to my panelists, I have Emmanuel Oloo Khisa from the Center of Digital Public Infrastructure. Emmanuel, can you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Tariro. My name is Emmanuel Khisa, and the Africa Director at CDPI. CDPI is a center based at an academic institute in India, IIITB. We work with countries to support them on two main tracks. We support them to develop their own DPI solutions, but we also work with countries to deploy DPI quickly in a fast track model we call DAS. I'm pleased to be here, Tariro, and thanks for having me. Thanks.
Welcome and thank you. And then we move to Garikai Nhongo from Co-Develop. Garikai, please introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Tari, and thanks for having me. It's good to be here. Great initiative 20for Good is, and we're looking forward to a good discussion. So my name is Garikai Nhongo. I am the Global Communications Lead at Co-Develop, but also I think I've done a lot of work with countries across Africa in terms of digital transformation. And so this discussion on, agriculture and DPI is a point of discussion and comes at a good place in time for us to be able to discuss food security and how technology, in particular DPI, can be able to transform our continent. I think a bit later I'll go into what Co-Develop does, but back to you, Terry.
All right, thank you. Now, looking at digital public infrastructure in the context of agri-innovation and how it brings that impact to society, allowing connectivity, allowing transparency, and in general, just advancing a nation's economic goals. And when applied to within agriculture, and then it advances rural communities, youth, as well as women, and brings that higher yield or greater productivity. But still focusing on how that technology will bring in or stimulate job creating ecosystems. This is the framework that we're discussing or that we want to bring to the fore. But I want to start with your organizations and maybe some definition of digital public infrastructure. And this I'll pose to Emmanuel. Yeah. So, Center of Digital Public Infrastructure. Give us a brief on digital public infrastructure and the role of your institution once again.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks once again, Tariro. So CDPI, as the name suggests, it's a Center for Digital Public Infrastructure. The only one of its kind, I think, and we work to demystify the whole concept of DPI. We work with both the public sector and private sector to demystify what's DPI. Now, if I could just break it down a bit, what is DPI? So DPI, I hope you can hear me. What's message? Okay, cool. Yeah, so DPI is a very emergent thinking, maybe about 2 years old, and it comes from a framework of decades long, I think maybe 2 decades of trying to digitize public sector, trying to digitize government, trying to digitize delivery of digital services, but without much success. And we then found several reasons for this. One, which was um, closed loop systems. The other was vendor locked systems. There's issues around proprietary standards that cannot talk to each other. And so, in thinking about how to solve for this problem, CDPI was set up in order to support governments to inculcate DPI thinking. So when we go into DPI thinking, we start to ask ourselves, what is DPI thinking? DPI thinking is a process of building infrastructure for public good that allows for open standards to be applied, allows for reusable artifacts to be shared, allows for interoperability of the built solutions, and ensures that scalability is achieved in our markets or in our ecosystem in our countries. So without going into too much of the technical jargon around it, because we are in a farming ecosystem, DPI focuses on four main building blocks. If you think about them as rails upon which technology is then executed. And so these rails are identity, payments, data exchange, and at CDPI, we then have two additional rails, and these rails are trust infra and discovery services. And we will unpack it a bit later on how all these five foundational uh, rails are able to support uh, communities and governments and the private sector ecosystems to build scalable models and solutions uh, for delivering agriculture and making it profitable for those involved. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So I heard amongst the rails, that's digital payments, which I think would be very beneficial to all sorts of farmers, including women. And I also heard data exchange, which brings that information. So we would say that some or most women, or let's say rural women, are kind of homebound because of the other work that we do. So technology helps us be close to home and still be able to participate in the economy. So all of those things are essential and critical to empower and help us be part of the future jobs that we're talking about. So I'll move to Garikai and tell us about co-develop. Now, what is the role of co-develop within the ecosystem?
Absolutely. I think we like to describe ourselves at co-develop as an enabler. Our role is really to enable the ecosystem, to strive for excellence within the deployment of DPI. So co-develop is a grant-making organization, a fund. And what we do is we support organizations that are helping governments worldwide to deliver digital public infrastructure. And what we do is we fund organizations in four main buckets. The first one is the digital public goods. So these are your open source solutions that are layered on top of DPI to be able to deliver various solutions. We also fund technical assistance, which is more or less the work that Emmanuel and CDPI do in terms of providing technical assistance to governments in order to build their architecture for DPI. We then also fund research. I think, like Emmanuel correctly said, DPI is an emergent field. So there's a lot to still learn. And what we do is we are funding organizations that help to expand this body of knowledge. And then in addition to that, we are also now funding the ecosystem, because for us, it's important that DPI is always safe and inclusive. And so it's important that we are funding within that framework, that the countries are building safe and inclusive DPI as we go along. Now, in terms of a definition, I think Emmanuel really went into the meat of it on the technical level. And how I like to talk about DPI is firstly on the importance of it. For the last decade and a half, we've been talking about technology helping Africa to leapfrog, but we've never quite talked about how. And I think the DPI then tackles that how question in terms of how we're going to help Africa to be able to leapfrog. If you take a look at 2022 numbers, and depending on who you talk to, the global spend that government spent on IT is between $550 billion and $690 billion, depending on the stats you're looking at or what's thrown into that basket. 23 countries spent 80% of that money. That means the other 170 odd of us spent only 20%, which means dollar for dollar, we can never compete in terms of digital transformation with the countries that are developed or the more mature economies. What that means is that the only way in which we can make this work for us is to think differently. Hence the infrastructure thinking that Emmanuel was talking about. And the infrastructure thinking is the baseline for DPI. The technology is the easy part. The thinking, the architecture is where the hard work is done. And the ability for our dollar to work harder is where DPI wins. So that's where the value is coming in. And I love that we're talking about it in the context of agriculture, because no matter how developed anyone becomes, we still need to eat. And so ideally, this becomes an important way in which we're able to continue to develop. I could say a lot more, but allow me to pause there. And then as we go along in the discussion, I'll throw in a few more nuggets here and there. Back to you, Ted.
Okay, great, Garikai. And you were talking about this infrastructure thinking. Now, when we hear about DPI, we know the success story of India and Aadhaar and how that has, created a value chain or a system, the India stack, which reaches to agriculture as well. But on the continent, on the African continent, to what extent have we also tried to embody, like you say, leapfrogging, thinking different, infrastructure thinking? And I want to hear from Emmanuel. And you can put it in an agricultural context. What is happening? What is happening on the continent? Are there some examples?
Thank you, Tariro. I think there's a lot happening. I think there's a real awakening around the whole concept of the building blocks of DPI. So if you think about identity, for example, a lot of African countries, probably about 6 active implementation of digital identity, DPI oriented digital identity, either at beginning points or advancing at the moment at registration level. If we focus and narrow down to agriculture, we have some fascinating stories. I think there's a great deal of stuff to be said. We're proud of a cohort member of CDPI, Kuza, which is building next level agri-tech platform, and they've just managed to convert it into a DPI play using backend protocol here in Kenya. They are creating jobs and opening up the ecosystem through their agripreneur model. The agripreneur model basically just makes one person in a community the focal point to extend agricultural services using technology. So they can train, they can be extension workers, they can be market discovery people, they can connect the farmer to market, and all this is happening on their phone through an ONDC based backend protocol where you're able to discover networks of farmers, networks of agripreneurs, and networks of credit service providers within your ecosystem. So that's an example of a clear use case of DPI for ag. There's Malawi with Opportunity International, where you now have opportunities to translate Chichewa, use a chatbot in Chichewa, and interact with your device either on WhatsApp and query for any agriculture information. Of course, this is connected to the Ministry of Agriculture in Malawi. In Ethiopia, there is a growing, still at early stages, but conversations around how do we link um, a digital ID ecosystem to farmer output. In Zambia, there is use of open source tools to support farmer input support program. So there's a lot of DPI thinking that's being inculcated within the continent. As examples, because as we say, it's easier when people can see it within their ecosystem, within their neighborhood. So I'll stop there, Terry.
Thanks, Emmanuel. And I heard about you talking about agri-entrepreneurs. I heard you talking about connecting farmers to markets. That's information, a lot of technology, the accessing through your device. So I'm going to move to Garikai and give me, in the context of a rural woman, the kind of skills, right? As we move into this digitized economy, where for me to really get the benefits of DPI or of the new technology that will bring me a higher yield or get to me better prices, what are the skills that are required along the value chain? And if we were to create those jobs, how can we be part of or be employed in the jobs?
It's a really good question, because there's so many stats that talk about the jobs of the future, and they're telling us that some will say 60% of the jobs of the future are not here yet, so we don't know what they are. We don't have the skills for them yet. Some will say 85% for those who are more ambitious, and the number could be anywhere in between. But the reality of it is, we need to have some level of digital literacy, and that becomes important for us to be able to benefit as much as we can from the digital transformation that's taking place. And so it comes down to a number of the basics in terms of how to be able to use this technology and to be able to implement it. But what I'll say, though, is that in some cases, we've seen DPI that's even built for people who have no literacy. In some cases, there are digital platforms that are built for no phone. And so as much as people continue to learn the skills, the pace of learning skills may not meet the pace of the transformation that's taking place. So as we develop for inclusion, we need to be able to develop for those who will struggle with literacy, who can't read or write, or those who may not have the devices that we need. But as we go along, we need to be able to build more homegrown solutions. And so as the industries continue to develop, we need to be able to get people who can code, get people who can be able to identify the problems and begin to create solutions that are unique to their own contexts. And so creating skills even in rural areas is important, whether it's for that rural woman or the rural child. As we go along, I think it's important for us to be able to contextualize this, because we're moving away from a one-size-fits-all environment where you get something from a box and you're good to go. Even if you're using open source solutions, you still need to customize them to your local context. And these are skills that need to be developed. So you'll find that as co-develop does work across the world, really, what we're trying to do is to ensure that we've got the capacity for local skills to be developed. And we're not prescribing what those skills are, because each local context in itself is quite different. And so we're saying, let the local people be able to identify what it is that they're going to require based on the needs of that local community. And we as an enabler then creates the facility for people to be able to get that done. And that, I think, is a good way for us to take a look at development so that we're not developing, we're not giving solutions to people, but we're allowing them to be able to build and develop solutions themselves. So this then also will track and talk to entrepreneurship as well. So yeah, I think the skills question is a really broad question. It's important that we are coding or building for where we are now as we begin to develop the skills as we go forward. Thanks for that, Ted.
Yeah, Garikai, and talking about designing, inclusive designing, and I want Emmanuel to come in. You would have an overview of what's happening on the continent and some of the challenges that we're facing as we try and prepare for the future, prepare for the digital economy, but also make sure that it's inclusive, right? So that our youth can participate in the agri-innovations, in the agricultural ecosystem, for the new jobs that would create for them, as well as for women. Give us some of the challenges that governments or ecosystem players are facing it as we, talk about this digital public infrastructure. Let's have this infrastructure thinking. Let's leapfrog. Let's, what are the challenges that we're facing?
Thanks again, Tariro. Yeah, so the primary one of the biggest challenges, and we rarely talk about it on this continent, is just you'd be amazed at the sheer lack of belief in the possibilities, right? And for every transformation, we've got to start by an inward belief that it can be done. And I cast my mind at many initiatives that I've seen that have been going well. It's down to having a useful champion, but then believe that it's possible. So I'll start with that as a me looking in the mirror at ourselves as a continent. And I think the second is obviously just the fact that there's a lot of entrenched interests. And of course, entrenched interests are always there. But sometimes the shifting the needle on some of these changes and transformation that we're looking at calls for a lot of political will. And sometimes that same political will is the beginning of the problem sometimes. I mean, in many cases now, the ID projects in Kenya and Nigeria, we're starting to see a lot of fights and push and pull, where you sort of imagine that this would be easy to do and very easy for people to see the sense and work with it. But then you discover that political will and entrenched interest is a blocker. But onto a positive, good problems to have. I think there's while there is not enough technical capacity within certain markets to solve the problem, technical capacity exists across the border in other countries. And so we're starting to see a lot more interesting developments. For example, the Zimbabwean technical capacity, for example, out of Harare, going into Lilongwe in Malawi and building the country's first digital identity program. Now, I mean, one would then choose to say, oh, but it's technical capacity, it's not there. But then you still discover that, but it was done by technical capacity just across the border from Zimbabwe. So I choose to see this as an opportunity. There's opportunity we could do better, when it comes to looking at open source and DPI and DPGs as yet more an answer to a very closed loop vendor interest-based ecosystem that's driven digitization over the last 20 years, to start asking and questioning ourselves, how do we build differently in a new world where we have the freedom to have our own um, technical experts build solutions in a context they understand better. I think that's really critical. I think there's also just the fact that development actors uh, have, have pushed a lot of the initiatives that are much more uh, proprietary based, solutions on the continent, and created uh, a sense to which solutions are harder to get rid of, but also very expensive to deploy, and then even much more expensive to maintain. So you find in ecosystems where dollars are hard to come by, countries are forced to pay huge sums of dollars and looking for FX, to just sustain programs, and this lead to programs just flopping. And so DPI comes in to sort of try and assess these questions and say, okay, fine, can we work on a design paradigm that allows you to be in control, that allows you to manage your own future and plan towards that? And then finally, I think as CDPI, we then sat around and figured, okay, it's enough to tell countries that you need to design uh, solutions, you need to do X, Y, Z, but how do you get started? And this is where I talked earlier about DAS, DPI as a package solution, where we come into a country as we're helping you to design. We also support you to then showcase to you what are the possibilities. How do you then deploy this very quickly, rapidly in an environment that doesn't uh, lead to a lot of lost momentum? And before you know it, the champion for the project has moved to another ministry. So you find that this has been a bit of one of those very critical areas for us, a revelation almost, in how to quickly uh, attack the problems of procurement, vested interest, vendor control projects, and create a new paradigm, a new pathway for more solutions. Thank you.
If I can add on to the challenges that Emmanuel was talking about, I think one of the biggest challenges that we find across most African governments, and we've worked with quite a few, is that the design of government is in silos. Whereas for DPI to work, we need to break those silos for there to be a lot of these departments working together. And so the health department will do its own thing. It will build its own full stack solution, which costs a lot more money that the government doesn't have, and replicates a lot of things. When the ID or the Home Affairs builds its own, it's in its own silo. Again, replicating things that are in the health system, whereas this could all be shared. Lands will do the same when they're registering land and so on. And so these siloed systems are creating strong fiefdoms where no one is willing to let go of that particular silo that they have. And that for development, whether it's in agriculture or in any other sector, makes it a lot more expensive, makes it a lot more complicated. What we're saying with DPI thinking or infrastructure thinking is that you could share your foundational layers so that you no longer have to restart from the beginning. What also then complicates it is that you often find that in most governments, the Ministry of ICT is in charge of digital transformation, but they're in many ways considered a junior ministry by most governments. And so, no, I'm yet to see a president who's won an election because of a digital manifesto. So their manifesto is about other things. So the Ministry of ICT generally doesn't have the muscle to then demand or to create the foundational layers that you need for DPI. And then this then complicates the processes in terms of breaking these silos. It's not an impossible task. It's a difficult one, certainly, but one that's taking place in terms of breaking these silos. Once we're able to break these, I think you'll find that we're able to deliver services to our people in a more efficient and cost-effective manner. And I think that would be an important challenge to be able to recognize. And taking from what Emmanuel talked about in terms of political will, you'd need the political will to be able to break down these silos so that we can ensure that everything works well with the foundational DPI layers.
Okay, great. So is there an African country that is a champion or has the political will? Is there a country on the continent that has actually reused something that was a DPI that was successful in health and maybe reused it for something in agriculture, having that same foundational building blocks or architecture? Emmanuel, I'm going to give
Yeah.
I'm giving this one to you.
Yes.
What
Yeah.
they should
Indeed.
tell us about Kenya. Kenya is highly digitized, a very successful
Yes,
digital
but
pay.
also highly siloed and um, highly politicized in terms of that doesn't allow some of this the way we're thinking about infrastructure thinking. Um, you got to understand that I think it's very important to cultivate trust in all these conversations we are having, particularly in digital. Um, Cultivating trust is very important in a world where there's a lot of privacy concerns that are continuing to evolve. I mean, it's very important to cultivate trust. But I would say countries like Nigeria are really ahead when it comes to the whole conversation where you're thinking about establishing uh, an African stack. Uh, Niger stack is not very far from being a reality because they have a thriving identity environment. They have a thriving payments environment, and they just needing to unlock the thriving data exchange environment. So they 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 look like to me one of those front runners. Um, Kenya has a lot of digitizations that have happened. I mean, it's very digitized, but a lot of it is vendor driven digitization. So that's also partly and very siloed as a consequence because one vendor operates on their own standards and their own thing and they do it and they really succeed with it because there's a big market. So they succeed. But there's no sharing of information that's happening between uh, different programs. So that creates a sense there of a challenge. Zambia, a country that Garikai and myself have been tracking for some time now and trying to do some good work in. Um, Working very well on this reusable artifacts conversation where you implement an eKYC project and it's then linked to uh, healthcare and then linked to disaster management, social protection type of payments, and it's linked to financial services in the private sector. So they are doing some things very good. Um, Malawi doing amazing stuff around digital ID coupled with digital payments in that ecosystem. Still, they're working on data exchange part on an e-government level. Uh, and so lots of encouraging signs for there's Cabo Verde uh, for their work in digital health and COVID response, where they built amazing tool to manage the COVID crisis, a DPI for healthcare. Uh, for a small island country, they're quite uh, impressive in what they do. It would be remiss of me not to talk about Rwanda and their Irembo system that's been what Garikai spoke about. The technology doesn't just have to be about using a device, smart this and smart instrument. It's also just how you make your technology applicable to the communities that are being served. So in Rwanda, it's digital, the government services portal, but that portal it applies assisted technology. You spoke about women, so women in the villages are able to walk into an agent or variable and access the service, from from the from the agent, and they would access a service through assisted tech because they're able to present their ID, and the attendant is able to solve the problem for them. So a lot is happening on the continent. There's Uganda with one of the most amazing. I think they won the WSIS international award uh, for DPI, for e-government service. It's called the UG Hub, Uganda Government Hub, and so yeah, so great initiatives all across us. Great spaces to learn. For the context of this call, DPI in ag, you'd have to look to Kenya, unfortunately, and look at a private sector player called Kuza, and for what they are doing, and also look at Malawi for what they are doing.
Thank you, and I'm glad that you brought data privacy issues, because that's a big issue for women farmers. I mean, sensitivity. If we're going to be transacting and bringing in our livelihoods on a device, on a digital system, then the trust issue is key, and that they people understand that they are protected. I just want to say to our participants, please, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. Because soon we want it to be very interactive, and we can pose some questions to our experts. So tell me, is data exchange and data governance in general being part of the rails for DPI? And I can start with Emmanuel again and then move to Garikai. Where are we? What's happening in terms of data sensitivity? Is it something that the continent is managing really well, or it's a sensitive issue and it's one of the things that's slowing us down? Can we hear about that?
Yeah, thanks, Sally. So it's both. It cuts both ways. I think over the last 3 or so years, one of the most powerful centers of governance has been the data controller of the Office of the Data Commission. They have been the data authority entities across the continent have grown in teeth and in bite. Uh, I, I attended a session just last week about all these conversations on data. I think there's a great deal of output coming out of these data entities, data authorities. So it's on the positive side. There's a lot more acknowledgement and realization of the centricity of privacy for the citizen, and the fact that if you're caught tampering or playing around or selling citizen data, you're gonna be fined. Uh, it's become so serious. Schools are not supposed to share visible images of children, without parental consent. I mean, it's becoming very, very healthy, I think, in terms of protection of citizen data. On the flip side, there's also the ugly side of it, where countries are very, so to speak, authoritative around issues around data sovereignty. So they are putting a lot of emphasis on data sovereignty to a point, it sort of stalls efforts at regional integration. So while you'd like to help and support a farmer across the border in the other country to be able to know about a market in the country next door, just the issues around how you go about it is such a problem. I mean, CFTA, Africa Continental Free Trade Area, is trying to resolve this through the whole digital trade protocol, which is sort of coming up with mechanisms for data exchange, cross-border data exchange. The AU has tried to work on some interoperability of data framework around the same, but it's still very difficult. And that, I think what this leads to inadvertently is it slows down the data the data exchange solutions, because you have to operate within the confines of the law. Now, going into the tech itself, we have lots of tech that's been coming up. X-Road has been growing in leaps and bounds. Look at the implementations in Botswana and what they're trying to do in Namibia, as well as in Benin. Those governments have implemented government-wide data exchange based on X-Road, which is by far the most advanced data exchange framework in application today on the continent. But there's opportunity, therefore, to work with a lot of this cross-border regional integration type organizations to create frameworks that allow for data to be shared among, say, SADC countries for a start, so that market for farm produce can be unlocked without necessarily exposing the farmers to the local brokers who then take advantage of them when there's actually opportunity for them to sell just 300 kilometers away across the border in another country. But you see, all that is limited because solutions, tech that could help discover the goods present and the opportunities are then limited by the fact that you can't share citizen data between country and country. And there's just a blanket conversation about the data being, it belongs to my citizen, you can't share it. It doesn't matter. It's a market discovery, data or anything like that. I'll stop there. Sure.
Okay. And Garikai, let's talk about startups. We're talking about data analytics, Internet of Things, things that can transform the agricultural ecosystem and create those new jobs. What is the role of startups? And I can imagine that we know that almost 42% by 2030 of all global youth will be African. Tell us the role of startups and how we can create these jobs for the future.
In my view, startups are the future. And I believe that we need to invest more in startups as a means to leapfrog and to be able to do more within our digital transformation journeys. And I'll give examples that are very specific to the subject matter that we're talking about in terms of agriculture. One of the things that is strong about startups versus a lot of your larger firms is that they've got the ability to start now and to start where we are and to start with what we have. And that's what Africa needs at the moment. We can't afford to wait. As they say, the future started yesterday. And so we need to be moving forward. And startups have that ability to pivot, to be agile, and to start now. But when you take a look at what we're able to do with DPI within an agricultural setting, and it actually responds to some of the questions that I've seen that the audience are asking, it's that we are able to create new industries that are responsive to things that are happening now, and that can be able to pivot. Now, for example, there was one question I think Malik was asking about smallholder farmers. If we are able to identify that Tariro owns this piece of land, whether it's ownership, whether it's a 99-year lease, all of a sudden, we now open up the potential for Tariro to be able to borrow. And now we're now bringing in a financial services aspect. Now we need someone who's able to design a financial services packet that is geared for smallholder farmers. And startups have the ability to be that agile and to be that quick to set up elements like that. Emmanuel talked about the other end of the spectrum where you're talking about markets, where now we somehow need to use our digital platforms to get these markets. We don't want to sell them in a place where they may not be, where there may not be a demand. So we need to sell them where there's a demand. Startups are able to create digital platforms that are able to help farmers to be able to ensure that they're selling their products where the market needs them. And so you're finding startups in every part of the chain in terms of delivering value. The beauty about them is that they're agile, and then they'll have the ability to scale. That becomes the question. How able are you to scale? But startups become those elements that we are able to test or to sandbox, I think is the term people like these days, each of the aspects that we want to do across the whole agricultural value chain to make sure that it works. And once it works, we're able to scale. So in my view, we need to invest in not just financially, but also in terms of knowledge and trust for our startups in order to be able to grow and leapfrog and develop within that agricultural value chain. I actually think the one that Emmanuel was talking about in Kenya is a startup, if I'm not mistaken. And they're working, creating jobs and driving the transformation happening in the agricultural sector. So vitally important. I'm a big champion for startups, so I could go on all day long if you let me, but let me let me pass the microphone back to you.
Yeah. So Garikai, since you opened up the answer, if you permit me, Tariro, I'll just quickly respond to the two questions. I think yes, indeed. This is one of those things where it's important to understand the real need. And I always, in my digital payments days, I kept asking myself, what's a real pain point? Is it really payments for a small business, or it's something else? Is it a loan? Is it those type of things? So in this instance, it's indeed true that fertilizers and seeds are the primary drivers, but to create a connection in digital is to then ask, could you then implement solutions like voucher systems, which are still tech driven, to create a precision and avoid leakage when disbursing any support in way of fertilizer and seeds to these farmers? I mean, that's now where um, the tools around DPI become critical. So when you apply digital identity, for example, to link a farmer's land to her ID, and then use that information to allow them to access seeds and fertilizer from a government agency, then you already begin to, and this is all delivered using GPS coordinates right to their farms. You start to um, disentangle the challenges around uh, digital versus ag. For the second question, Dean. So Nuruddin, we both Garikai and myself hosted Nigeria incidentally, Nairobi in March, where we went to great lengths discussing about DPI and Nigeria's attempts at creating a Niger stack and leading the continent as a giant that it truly is. And so I think the conversations are ongoing. Both co-develop and CDPI are in conversations with the Ministry of Digital Economy, with NIMSI, and also with NIPS. We've indeed trained uh, the Nigerian delegation uh, in, on DPI across those three functions: the NIMSI teams, NIPS teams, and all that. On your other question, concerns about privacy, data privacy of the beneficiary. Um, I don't have full context. I don't think the international NGO would be worried if the handling of the data of the beneficiary was in a secure and trusted way. DPI actually pushes not just to implement the foundational layers of, of, uh, of identity payments and exchange, but we also insist on ensuring that every solution built is built with privacy by design. So it needs to consider security at the heart of any design that is being designed to avoid possibilities uh, of leakage of data and of breach in privacy uh, protection. Thank you.
I want to move to our last points or final points, and I'll start with Garikai. I think Emmanuel was the one who was talking a lot, so I'll move to Garikai.
Yeah,
What are your final thoughts? Yeah, well, tell us what keeps you up at night, what Good Develop is thinking of that is, at the forefront in the context of Africa.
What keeps me awake at night is and I think it's an important point just to sum up my thoughts around this discussion is and I think it also talks to what Malik has pointed out in terms of smallholder farmers. There is no perfect time and there will never be perfect conditions. So it's important to start now and to start where we are and with what we have. Because the beauty of infrastructure thinking is, think of it as a domino effect. If all we can do is start in one district with a small group of people, and then if we're successful, we scale, let's do that. So that we are not waiting for the perfect system or the perfect solution or the perfect time when we can do everything that our hearts desire. It's important that we start because we don't have time. We have people who need these services, who need us to be able to move forward. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we need to be thinking very differently. We cannot be thinking in the same way in which we've been thinking all along. So if, for example, in Malik's scenario that he put forward, if the large farmers have access to funds, how can we make smallholder farmers also have access to funds? How can we unlock that? If that is your problem, you can actually workshop that with infrastructure thinking and be able to unlock that problem. And then if we are able to unlock that problem, ideally, if our premise is correct, it begins to steamroll into success for the rest of the thing. So there will never be a perfect time. There'll never be a perfect condition. Let's start small. Let's start where we are and with what we have. But the idea is let's start. Let's start, and so that we can move forward. So that'll be the message that I leave. And of course, co-develop as an enabler is there to support that start. And I think it's important that we're able to get forward because I think Africa needs this, and we're able to create a better future for our continent. Thanks, Ted.
Thank you, Garikai. And Emmanuel, any final thoughts? And then I'll conclude with telling you more information about 20forGood. But yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's exciting time to be around and to be able to witness all this growth. It almost reminds me at the turn of uh, the century, the millennium, and Tariro, believe it or not, I was alive and well at the time. Uh, we witnessed the growth of internet, the transformation it had, the rise of social media, and I look at the current transformation as well in those lenses, and the potential to transform our lives in our lifetime. So excited, and just in open invitation to everyone. I've shared my email in case you have to have a conversation to go deeper into design and and uh, and architecture issues of whatever solution you're working on. CDPI is a pro bono center. We we work for you, and we work for free for you. So we'll support you and help you to think through these solutions and get yourself on the other side. And thanks, Tariro and DFI for the invite.
Taro, before you close off, Abubakar has a very pertinent question, which I'd love to just tackle in 2 minutes if I can.
Sure.
So Abubakar is asking how we can place this in terms of African government's priorities. Look, we're thinking the same. So much so that we're actually bringing together countries, funders, development partners, academics, and the whole ecosystem, DPGs, private sector, in what we've termed the Global DPI Summit that's taking place in Egypt in October. I think it's the first of its particular kind, and the idea is for us to have those hard discussions so that we can be able to come out with solid solutions. So I think it's just to give you the hope that what you are thinking is what we are thinking too, and there are steps to be able to make this work. Tari, back to you.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank both of you, Emmanuel from CDPI, Garikai from Co-Develop, for joining the 20 for Good movement and being part of the conversation as we also make sure that our designs are inclusive and sustainable, that we bring in the youth and that we bring in rural women, and that we prepare for the future and make sure that we're solving for the world's most pressing challenges. And, we've started with agriculture, but we also thinking of good health, SDG 3, renewable energy, SDG 7. So join the conversation. And as we build that body of work and now move into working groups, we invite all participants to express their interest in joining some of those themes, joining our working groups so that we can raise awareness towards 20 for Good and make it our movement, 20 for Good, especially for the continent that we work in, our continent in Africa. So I just want to thank everyone for this opportunity to have this discussion. Thank you very much to Garikai and Emmanuel for sharing the knowledge.